Hi, my name's Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Today I'm with Dr. Arun Kundnani, the author of The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror. Arun, since the terrorist attacks of 9/11, a lot of Western governments have struggled to try to understand what makes a person become a terrorist, in the hopes that if they can identify some indicators, they can stop violence before it actually happens. You've argued that this has created a mini industry, think tanks, university, terrorism programs, in law enforcement, intelligence, task forces, and agencies trying to come up with models for radicalization. But radicalization is not a new theory. So what can the history of radicalization teach us about this new model that's being promulgated?
Right. So the thing about radicalization is that it kind of blurs the distinction between someone being involved in some kind of criminal violence and the kind of political ideas that are associated with that violence, right? And it kind of blurs that distinction. That's kind of what is distinctive about this concept, right? And if you understand that and go back through the history of national security agencies in the US over the last century, you can see that's a kind of recurring theme, right? So, you know, one of the things that I write about in the book is where do you first see a government agency that is using informants to target political activism, right? And actually, as far as I can tell, the first time that happens is in the Philippines, when the US has a colonial regime in the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century. You have in Manila political activists who are organizing for the independence of the Philippines from US colonialism, and a specialist police unit is set up by the colonial regime to run informants among the Filipino nationalists, gather information about their political activities, and to run adjunct provocateurs to criminalize people, to kind of push them into committing acts that you can then arrest them for, and to run kind of disinformation campaigns, right? That's the first time I think that you see that kind of systematic thing going on. And then after World War I, you see those same kind of practices coming back to the US mainland, right? So one of the things we know about when you have colonialism, the practices that you think are legitimate in that colonial setting sooner or later come back to the homeland, right? Coming from Britain, we've seen that repeatedly, you know, whether it's colonialism in Ireland or India, those things always come back home. So the same thing happens in the US after World War I. You start to get the creation of a kind of national security setup that aims to use these kinds of practices and these ways of thinking to target people who are engaged in legitimate political activity. So at the time, the main concern is around labor activism, right? And so you blur the distinction between someone who's involved in you know, trade union activity, organizing workers, and you frame them as you know, a subversive threat that's in some form of, you know, communist extremism or something like that. So it's essentially the same move that you get with the kind of radicalization models that we see today, but in a very different setting. And that's when you see the Palmer raids. Large numbers of people who are involved in the labor movement are rounded up and deported. The famous wording from the legal process around this is the phrase from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who talks about you know, the limit of free speech is when someone shouts fire in a crowded theatre, right? It's the famous thing that any law student quotes. But the actual case that comes from is a case of anarchists who were writing articles criticising the US involvement in World War I, right? So it's kind of you know, a classic example of how totally legitimate constitutional activity advocating for a particular political position can get interpreted as criminal activity, right? And obviously the irony is in a context where, you know, huge numbers of people are dying in this war in Europe. The one who's shouting fire is the anarchist advocating for peace, right? So And then if you come, if you come forward to the kind of post-World War II period, obviously in the Cold War, again, it's communism that is the kind of extremist threat of the day. But then within that notion of communist extremism, all kinds of different kinds of politics and activities can get wrapped up, right? So whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's people advocating for Puerto Rican independence, whether it's student activists, they can all get folded into this notion of extremism and therefore targeted using these same kinds of practices, informants, disinformation campaigns, provocation strategies to criminalize people, most famously in the case of COINTELPRO, which is the FBI's program to initially to target communists, but then eventually it becomes used against Black Power movement and so forth. So there's a continuity going back 100 years right up to the present period of the kind of post 9/11 period of these kinds of ways of thinking and these practices.